All right, folks, the next thing we're going to take up is interest groups. And this is the second of the political intermediaries that we've started talking about when we talked about political parties in the last discussion. And I want to open this conversation with an unpleasant discussion of mass shootings and gun violence in America. The graph that you see up before you is dated. It's from 2021. It's the first time I put together this particular opening to this section. And I could update it today with similarly dotted maps of the United States showing mass shootings throughout the country. There was one just yesterday that killed several people in Pittsburgh. They happen so often now that you almost become numb to them. I can't keep track of how many mass shootings we have because they're so commonplace. Far more commonplace in America than in anywhere else in the world. This is a graphic showing the number of public mass shooters per every 10 million people in the various continents and regions of the planet, and the U.S. is, by several times has more mass shootings. We could have a long discussion about guns in America, and again, my point here is not to presume to tell you what you ought to think about guns. I'm sure you probably have your own views, and that's fine, and maybe they differ from mine. That's fine. But certainly we could have a discussion about the proper balance between the individual rights to own a gun that some say are ensconced in the Second Amendment of our Constitution. There's a debate about that we could have as well, but let's say that it's there, versus what's in the greater interest, the greater good of society as a whole. I think most people would agree that there might be some reasonable limitations we could impose on gun ownership. Should criminals, violent criminals, have access to guns? Should the mentally ill have access to guns? Are all guns, should all guns be considered under this umbrella of gun rights? Are automatic weapons necessary in terms of the kinds of things protected under the Second Amendment? What about the gun buying process? Is it reasonable to check into the backgrounds of people who are trying to buy a gun? Is it reasonable to have a waiting period while that happens? Should we address not just licensed gun sales through retailers, but also private party sales and other means of getting guns? There is a range of opinion on all those issues in this country, and reasonable people can disagree. But in a democracy, which we presume to be, you would think that when large proportions of the public come down on a particular side on some of these issues, that's what public policy would do. The graph that you see now is an amalgamation of various polls asking people the level of support they have for various gun control measures. And the differences you see in terms of the colored bars represent the different polling firms that conducted the surveys. The Washington Post, ABC, Pew Research Center, Fox News, CNN, Associated Press, CBS, New York Times, etc. And so these surveys all took place around the same time, about 10 years ago. They asked slightly different question wordings. They asked different samples of people. So, of course, you're going to get varying levels of support. But what you see here is, the idea of adding armed guards and to protect our schools is not particularly widely supported. Maybe only a little over half the public likes that idea. The idea of banning assault weapons outright is even less popular. Banning certain kinds of ammunition, high-capacity clips, is a little more popular, perhaps, not that much. But when it comes to background checks, there's overwhelming support among the American public for that idea. Up to, depending on the sample and the question wording, over 75% of the public supports that. Up to 85-90% of the public supports at least that much. With that in mind, consider this. This is what happened in Congress around that same time, as the Senate in particular tried to take up the issue of background checks. That measure failed in the Senate. It failed by a vote of 54 in favor and 46 opposing it. Wait a minute. Doesn't that mean it won? If 54 senators wanted to legislate background checks and 46 opposed that, doesn't that? No, it doesn't mean it won because there was a Republican filibuster against the measure and it requires 60 votes to overcome a filibuster. So think about that for a second. A huge majority of the U.S. public wants expanded background checks. In particular, what they want to do is to close the gun show loophole. And I'll go back here, universal gun show background checks. Background checks are automatic when a firearm is purchased through a retailer, a gun store. But often sales take place at gun shows. They have these shows at various places throughout the United States. The Del Mar Fair has them fairly regularly. And often at those kinds of places, sales can take place and it's not a retail scenario, so the background check can be evaded. And of course, if you know you're not likely to pass a background check, but you want to buy a gun anyway, that's where you're going to do it. And by the way, if you're not likely to pass a background check, you're probably exactly the person that those background checks are needed for. The U.S. public, not surprisingly, overwhelmingly supports closing this gun show loophole and requiring universal background checks, and yet Congress failed to pass it. Why? Well, we'll talk more about this story later on in this discussion, but it reflects the power of some interest groups. And at this point, I want to make a point here, and it's a point about guns, but also a point about the logic of the American political system and why I like the textbook that we're using. You've heard the phrase, I'm sure, and you've probably used the phrase, money talks. And it does. But I don't want to let it go at that. Yes, money influences public policy. But there's more to it than that. I don't want to be just okay with that. In a democracy, the side with the most money shouldn't be the side that wins. The side with the more popular point of view, with the best point of view, should be the one that wins. And that's not necessarily the same thing as the one that has the most money. And so I don't want to sort of cynically just become inured to the idea that, well, the rich are going to prevail when it comes to public policy. But beyond that, though, I have to believe that this 90% of the public that supports universal background checks has more money than the small percentage of people who oppose that. As we'll get into later in this conversation, there's one main interest group that is really behind this opposition in the Senate to passing gun control legislation, and that's the National Rifle Association. The National Rifle Association is one of the single most powerful interest groups in the country. It has a huge effect in blocking any legislation on gun control. But its membership is about 5 million people. There are 330-something million people in this country, the vast majority of whom disagree with the NRA. So, okay, money talks, but this group of people, the 330 million people who are more overwhelmingly in favor of closing background checks, has a lot more money than the 5 million people in the NRA. So how is it that despite that reality, the NRA's position prevails? And we'll see exactly why that is in just a bit. But again, it gets to the underlying logic of our political system and our old friend, problems of collective action and free riding. First, let's get into what interest groups actually are. They're factions. They're groups of like-minded people who coalesce, they team up together, and they organize to petition government, which of course, the right to petition government is a First Amendment right. Their goal of interest groups is to influence public policy. They have some similarities to political parties. Parties want to influence policy as well, and parties are all about winning elections. Interest groups try to affect election results. They don't run candidates under their banner, but they certainly support candidates who share their point of view and oppose those who don't. But interest groups are also quite different from political parties. They focus on much more than elections. In fact, their real work happens after elections are over, and we'll talk about that in a bit. As I just said, candidates don't run under their label. They support them and they oppose them, but they don't perform the same function of political parties in that sense. And also, as you'll recall, I'm sure from our discussion of the two-party system, we have a two-party system. We have many more than two interest groups, which you might think would be a good thing. What they do is lobby. Lobbying means trying to exert influence or pressure on government, on policymakers, to enact the policies, the views that the interest group supports. And the text differentiates between two kinds of lobbying, inside versus outside lobbying. Inside lobbying is making direct contact with policymakers. It's donating to campaigns. It's meeting with them, writing position papers, sponsoring conferences, even helping write legislation. It happens. Lobbying is exerted upon the legislative branch, the Congress, the executive branch, even the judicial branch is subjected to lobbying. The text has a good slide, or a table, I should say. And I'll point it up here. This is the top 15 activities that interest groups themselves say they do under the guise of lobbying. And the higher the number here, this was on a 7-point scale ranging from 1 means we don't do that at all, to 7 means we do it constantly. These are the things that interest groups themselves report they do in their lobbying efforts. So the top thing is contacting congressional staffers directly to present their points of view, monitoring developments, keeping track of what's going on, identifying allies in Congress who might serve as champions of their cause, so finding members of Congress who they think share their point of view, contacting members of Congress directly to present their point of view, so that's one-on-one meeting with members of Congress, consulting with members of Congress and their staff to plan legislative strategy, entering into coalitions with other organizations, teaming up with other interest groups, consulting. Then this is one of my favorites. We're going to come back to this at the end of this conversation. Helping to draft legislation. That's interesting. So all that we've talked about so far is lobbying Congress. When you get down to the 9th activity, contacting members of the executive branch directly to present the point of view. Now they're talking about the presidency and the executive bureaucracy. Identifying allies within the executive branch. Other things, presenting research results or technical information. Now, of course, this research and technical information, it's not designed just to inform policymakers. It's also designed to persuade policymakers. So you might have cause to wonder how objective those research results and technical information is. Contacting undecided members, writing position papers, mobilizing constituents to contact their representatives, which is a point where we're going to come back to in just a second, and talking to the media. So those are the kinds of things that amount to what lobbyists do, and most of them are about inside lobbying. This is inside lobbying in action. This is a screenshot from a CNN story from 2011, I think it says. And this was in the aftermath of a nuclear disaster in Fukushima, Japan. You might remember there was an earthquake and a subsequent tsunami in Japan, and it damaged a nuclear reactor, the Fukushima reactor, and the environmental damage done from that, from the fallout from this nuclear failure, created a lot of concern and alarm about the safety of the nuclear industry throughout the world. The gentleman being interviewed here, and this is Dana Bash of CNN interviewing him, he is a lobbyist for the nuclear energy industry. And this is the hallway of the United States Senate. This is the hallway that has their committee meeting rooms. And the committee that he's standing outside is the Committee on Energy and Natural Resources. He is about to go into this committee room to try to persuade senators that nuclear energy is safe in the United States. He doesn't want them to react to this disaster in Japan by adopting any new regulatory requirements of the U.S. nuclear industry, because those would be burdensome to them, to their bottom line, their profits. That is the epitome of inside lobbying. Members of the interest group lobbying directly members of Congress on behalf of their interests. The other type of lobbying, as we mentioned already, is outside lobbying, and that is pressuring policymakers indirectly, trying to set the public on policymakers to change, so the policymakers will change their view. And it was mentioned up here as one of the things that lobbying do, mobilizing constituents to contact their representatives. So one thing that really is part of what lobbyists do from the inside is to start to work on the outside. So this comes in the form of organizing rallies and protests and marches and all kinds of petition campaigns, social media and email and actual old-fashioned letters. And again, the whole point is to organize the public, to get the public to bring pressure on lawmakers, rather than lobbyists themselves directly pressuring them, getting them to notice that the public is worked up about something. And sticking to the example of the nuclear industry, this is an example of outside lobbying. This is mass protest outside the San Onofre nuclear energy plant before it was closed. So on the same issue, these folks obviously are against nuclear energy. In terms of the number of interest groups, we have 2 viable political parties. We have many, many thousands of viable interest groups. And there's no single way to categorize these, but here's one that makes some sense. Some interest groups serve the economic interests of their members. As you can think of the Chamber of Commerce, for example, serving the interest of business, or the AFL-CIO, a labor union. Some interest groups serve the public interest. The Sierra Club is an environmental interest group. Common Cause is a good government, clean government interest group. And I separated those 2 from the others because we're going to make a big point about the differences in incentives when it comes to supporting economic interest groups, the members supporting economic interest groups versus the public supporting public interest groups. That's an important point that we're going to come back to in a minute. Other kinds of interest groups include government. There are actual government lobbies. The National Conference of Mayors, for example, is an interest group that lobbies Washington on behalf of cities in the United States. The mayors of those cities have gotten together to lobby Washington to advocate for greater resources to be allocated to their cities for all kinds of things. There are religious interest groups like the Christian Coalition. There are civil rights interest groups like the National Organization of Women, for example. There are ideological interest groups, the Americans for Democratic Action, the American Conservative Union. There are issue groups that focus on single issues. The National Rifle Association is one. The Mothers Against Drunk Driving is another. They focus on their cause and only their cause. They don't have this broad umbrella of issues they're advocating on behalf of. So that point, thousands of groups representing thousands of interests, I think it's pretty safe to say that virtually every issue or controversy in American politics has an interest group that represents its point of view. And this could be viewed as constituting interest group pluralism. This is the kind of check against factions that the founders hoped would exist in our country. It's interest group pluralism refers to the idea that if you have many, many interest groups on all sides of all the various issues in the country, they can kind of hold each other in check. They're preventing any one group from dominating all the time. I'll borrow a sports metaphor here. In the NBA, the Denver Nuggets just won the NBA championship. The year before, the Golden State Warriors won the championship. I think the year before that was it the Milwaukee Bucks. The year before that, I think, would have been the Lakers during the pandemic. The Toronto Raptors won it the year before that. There is no dominant team in the NBA. There is no dynasty. The Warriors would be the closest thing of recent years, but even they are falling by the wayside and have won one championship in the last 5 or 6 years. That's pluralism. That's pluralistic competition. There are so many relatively evenly balanced teams that it's very difficult for any one of them to dominate and win the championship every year. If you follow sports, you're probably aware of things like salary caps and luxury taxes. The whole point of those measures is to prevent any one team from having the financial resources to dominate the entire league. There are no super teams that can just have more money. They're from a big market, New York or Los Angeles probably. There are no super teams that can just use their vastly superior resources to buy all the best players and win the championship every year. Salary caps and luxury taxes work against that. And the whole point is to have this pluralistic competition to prevent any one team from dominating. That's exactly what the founders had in mind in terms of controlling factions. If you'll refer back to the first discussion we had in this class about Federalist number 10, and that might have been the second discussion, I can't remember. Federalist number 10, using size and competing interests to control factions. So given that we have this many interest groups representing all sides of all the many issues in American politics, you might think that James Madison would be pleased that we would have factions under control. If you thought that, you'd be wrong. One of the more famous political scientists of the 1950s and 60s was a guy named E.E. Schottenschneider. He went by E.E. because his first name was Elmer. If your first name was Elmer, you'd probably go with the initial as well. And he was one of the first to study the power of interest groups in American politics. And he had, in one of his books, he had a famous sentence, and it was this: "The flaw in the pluralist heaven is that the heavenly chorus sings with a strong upper-class accent." What he's saying there is that not all interest groups have equal influence. Some have a built-in resource advantage. And this point was further elaborated fairly recently in another book called The Unheavenly Chorus, which is a direct reference to the Schachtschneider quote. It's by three political scientists known as Schlotzman, Verba, and Brady. They studied the current state of interest group activity in the United States and found that organizations representing those with deep pockets vastly outnumber advocates of the middle class and the poor. And of the billions of dollars spent annually on lobbying in Washington, 72% comes from organizations representing business interests, and no more than 2% from organizations representing the vast majority below the very top. Here is some data from that exact study by those same people, Schlotzman, Verba, and Brady. I'm going to take some time to look at this to make sure we appreciate what this table is representing. And really what I want to focus on is this part right here. What this shows is different types of people in the workforce. Executives, the very top. Professionals, the tier just below that. And so those would be obviously CEOs of companies and the like. Professionals would be doctors and lawyers and professors. And then below that, you have more average workers, white-collar workers, blue-collar workers, farm workers, the unemployed, those not in the workforce. So that's what's being arrayed here in this column. This column shows the percentage of the population that these categories comprise. So executives amount to about 8.5% of the U.S. population. Professionals amount to about 13%. So combined, those two are about 22% of the population. We'll call it 20% just to round off to keep the math easier. So about 20% of the population would fall in these high income categories, executives and professionals, meaning the bottom 80% is all down here. Look at the percentage of organizations lobbying Washington on behalf of those categories of people. 70.3% of the organizations lobbying Washington represent executives. 23.7% represent professionals. Combined, that's 94% of all organized interests lobbying Washington. 94% of interest group activity in Washington, D.C. is done on behalf of 20% of the population. If you're any good at math, you can therefore deduce that 6% of interest group activity is devoted to the bottom 80% of the American public. That is not exactly a balanced, pluralistic setting where certain interests can offset other interests. Quite the reverse. And here's where I want to get into the logic of what's going on here. This is why I like this text. This is why it's important to understand incentives and the underlying fundamental logic of our political system. Consider the differences between groups advocating on behalf of their members' self-interest, either a directly economic self-interest or some other type of self-interest, advocating on behalf of a policy that really benefits them only. It doesn't offer any kind of widespread benefit. Think about single-issue advocacy. The National Rifle Association advocating against any sort of a closure of the gun show purchasing loophole that now exists and evading background checks. Think of lobbyists for industries, whether it's the extractive industries, that's coal, oil, and gas, or the pharmaceutical industries. Industries lobbying on behalf of the financial wherewithal and well-being of their members. Think about that versus groups that are advocating on behalf of a public good. There's a group called the Brady Campaign that has been lobbying for gun control for decades, and it owes back to a guy named James Brady, who was Ronald Reagan's press secretary. And when there was an assassination attempt on Reagan, Reagan was injured, not terribly badly, although at his age any kind of gun wound is bad. But Brady James Brady was severely injured. He never fully recovered from his wounds. And on his behalf, an interest group was started called the Brady Campaign Against Gun Violence. Think of the Sierra Club, which I've already mentioned as an environmental interest group. So we've got two kinds of categories of interest groups, those that are advocating on behalf of member self-interest and those that are advocating on behalf of a public good. Here's where the problem starts. We're back to the problems of collective action. And an economist named Mansur Olson is most famous for popularizing this idea, but he made the point, and we already talked about this, the benefits of a group's success are often available broadly and can't be denied to non-members. This is the free rider problem once again. The free rider problem boils down to the incentive that we might have to enjoy the benefits of a collective good despite not having helped to produce them. And this is where that difference that I'm talking about comes into play. Public interest groups advocate on behalf of a benefit that is broadly available. If it's achieved, it is widely available. It cannot be limited to only those who helped bring it about. If the Brady campaign is successful in regulating gun violence and making the public safer, you can't make that safe public space available only to those who contributed to the Brady campaign. I get to enjoy it as well, even though I've never given them $1. If the Sierra Club is successful in cleaning the air, you can't allocate that clean air to Sierra Club members only. We all get to breathe it. But that's the problem. The non-excludability of these public goods creates the temptation on our part to not support the groups because we get to enjoy the benefit of what they did regardless of our failure to contribute to it. But of course, the problem that creates is if enough of us think that way, we don't contribute and they don't achieve those public benefits. But think about it from the standpoint, think about groups that are advocating on behalf of private interests in contrast. If you're seeking a private good, the benefits are exclusive to your group. So there really isn't an incentive to not contribute. If your group is if your lobbying effort is successful, you get the benefit. If it isn't successful, you don't get that benefit. There's no free rider issue here. Either you get it or you don't. So if you're advocating on behalf of unrestricted gun show buying at gun shows, or if you're trying to advocate on behalf of the right to drill oil in the Alaskan Wilderness Refuge, for example, the benefits are to your group exclusively. Now, you could argue that, yes, if the NRA succeeds in preventing any kind of closure of the gun show loophole, that benefits me as well. I mean, I could take advantage of that, except I don't want that. That's not the policy I desire. I don't want to be able to buy a gun without a background check. I want to have background checks. So really, this benefit is exclusive to those that want it. And the right to drill oil, the profits that would come from giving the oil industry access to wilderness refuge areas where they think there's oil to drill, those profits don't go to me. Those profits go to the oil industry. So the benefits are exclusive to the group, and it completely circumvents this free rider problem that public interest groups face. Well, how does this play out in the real world? Here's how. This is election spending over the year by a couple of different interest groups. And we've already talked about both of them, the National Rifle Association and the Brady Campaign. And I wish whoever created these next two graphs should be fired, because there really needs to be a better color differentiation besides just this sort of mustardy yellow of the NRA spending versus the slightly dirtier mustardy color of the Brady campaign. But you get the point. The big bars are the Brady campaign spending on election campaigns, and it goes back from 1990 through 2012 in the many millions of dollars is what the NRA is spending in support of campaign donations for candidates that share their views on guns. The tiny little bars that sometimes you don't even see at all and you can barely see is the Brady campaign. So right here, not even $1 million in any of these cases versus many, many millions of dollars. That's one side of interest group spending on elections, trying to influence elections. Here's another side, and that is lobbying expenditures. This is money spent after the election, once policymakers are in office, directly contributing to policymakers. And here again, you see the exact same thing. The big bars representing lots of lobbying expenditures are for the National Rifle Association. The smaller bars are for the Brady campaign. You'll notice that the Brady campaign spends a lot more on lobbying, as does the NRA, than on campaigning. And there's a reason for that, and we'll get to that in just a minute. But again, whether you're looking at campaign spending or once in office spending on lobbying policymakers, the National Rifle Association vastly outspends the Brady campaign. This gets to the point I made at the beginning of this conversation. The position favored by 5 million people, and that's roughly the number of NRA members there are in the country, trumps the position favored by at least 225 million Americans. And I'm basing that estimate on 80% of 300 million plus Americans who want universal background checks. How in the world can the views of 5 million trump 225 million? Well, it's because of this. Most of us have never given a dime to the Brady campaign. Donations in support of the NRA among its membership are most of them do. In fact, you have to be a member, you have to donate. You have to contribute financially for your membership. I think, and again, bear in mind that the amount of wealth controlled by this 225 million people vastly outnumbers the amount of wealth in the hands of this 5 million NRA members. It's not really about who has the money, it's about who's willing to spend the money. And the nature of the incentives confronting each side, most of us are free riding on the hope that the Brady campaign and other gun control lobbying efforts can achieve greater gun safety in this country, can affect our political process to persuade Congress and the presidency to enact stricter gun requirements, gun control. We're hoping for that, but we're not really contributing to that. The vast majority of us, myself included, I'll confess it right here, because we're free riding. That temptation to free ride does not affect the NRA. They don't have the temptation. Their incentive is to contribute to get what they want. I want to go back to that point about campaign versus lobbying expenditures. And this is a look at about 20 years of data in terms of all interest group activity combined on the two efforts. And again, I don't know why chart makers don't do a better job of differentiating. And this is from the text, so I guess I'm bashing the text I had you buy. But the turquoise color here represents total lobbying expenditures over the course of 2000 to 2018. And the whatever shade of green that is represents campaign expenditures. And what you can see here is that interest groups spend a whole lot more money on lobbying expenditures than they do on campaign expenditures. And if that strikes you as odd, again, think about the logic that's driving those kinds of decision makings. Campaign donations are risky. First off, you probably, if you're an interest group, you're not going to spend money on a campaign on an election that you know is going to go a certain way. Elections that are sure things, that are one-sided, there's not a whole lot of reason to try and influence that election because you know how it's going to go. So a safe congressional seat, for example, a seat where the incumbent enjoys a huge advantage in terms of the partisan makeup of the district and it hasn't lost in 20 years, you're not going to spend a lot of money on that. The election campaigns that you're going to spend money on are the close ones, the competitive ones. But by definition, then, it's a risky investment. Those kinds of competitive races are kind of a coin flip, meaning that there's about a 50-50 chance you could be wasting your money. If you donate to the losing side, you've wasted your money. Lobbying expenditures, though, are a sure thing. Lobbying expenditures are financial contributions given to people in office, the ones who won the election. Your money is definitely going to the person in power at that point, the person with the capacity to influence policy in the way you want. So it makes sense from that standpoint that interest groups do spend on campaigns, and they do spend millions, but they spend a whole lot more, billions, on lobbying. And there's a great section in the book, by the way, and be sure you read this, about why it's worth it. When you look at the amount of money that major corporations, AT&T and others, for example, spend in lobbying every year, and the sums are so staggering that you might wonder, can it possibly be worth it? Well, it is worth it because they're making billions while spending millions. This gets to one other point along these lines, and that is, how do these public interest groups survive at all? Like, why does anybody contribute to them? When it makes, from a strictly rational, logical standpoint, much more sense to free ride and hope that they're successful, but, why should you bother to contribute? There are really two reasons why people support public interest groups in the first place. One is just a sense of duty, moral incentives. This you can think of as maybe the extent to which altruism does work to overcome free riding. You recall that we talked about 4 ways that societies produce collective goods and combat free riding: anarchy, altruism, and then the 2 that typically work in mass societies: markets, incentives, and government. Well, altruism motivates some to some extent. Some people have a moral duty to contribute despite the rational incentives not to. Some people will contribute just because they believe it's the right thing to do, not because they have any sort of sense that they're going to change things by themselves, their lone contributions. It's not really that. But it's the argument that not everybody thinks in coldly rational, self-interested terms. Some people do things out of just a sense of obligation and duty. Frankly, it's why I bother to vote every election. We'll get into this one in the last section of the class when we talk about elections, but voting is a completely irrational action. When over 100 million votes are cast in a presidential election, for example, the odds of my one vote affecting anything are statistically 0. But I vote anyway. I'm not irrational. I just think it's my duty. It's one of the few things that a citizen in a democracy ought to do. So, moral incentives work to some extent. The other thing is selective incentives. Public interest groups can't compel contributions. If we go back to those last 2 ways of producing collective goods that work in modern societies, the force of government forcing people to not free ride, to pay your taxes, to do the things you're supposed to do. Public interest groups can't do that. They can't force us to contribute to them, so they try and incentivize it. They try and offer some sort of private benefit that we can't get unless we join up in their cause. So here's the Sierra Club's marketing pitch, I should say. If you join the Sierra Club, and the reason you would join the Sierra Club is to add your voices to the hundreds of thousands of Americans committed to leaving our children a living legacy: clean air, safe drinking water, and natural grandeur. So it's an environmental group. You get a tote bag. The first thing listed as the benefits of joining the Sierra Club is this free Sierra Club insulated cooler tote for a limited time only. How cool is that? So the Sierra Club is trying to change the incentives here, from making it not about, if the Sierra Club succeeds, we all get to enjoy a cleaner environment and cleaner air, but rather if that's the case, then why don't you go, Sierra Club, you clean up the air, and then I will breathe that clean air without ever supporting you. They're trying to flip the equation here. If I join the Sierra Club, I get this cool tote bag. Sweet. Well, here's how that fight works out. There's a website called opensecrets.org, and it's the best resource available to track lobbying and campaign expenditures in the American political system. If you want to try and follow the money in American politics, opensecrets.org is the place to do it. In 2022, the oil and gas industry spent $124.4 million on federal lobbying, amid record profits earned in 2022. So keep that number in mind: $124 million spent by the oil and gas industries lobbying our government versus the $78,948 spent by the Sierra Club in 2022. The moral of the story is tote bags get you only so far. I have to laugh here too as I'm looking at this. This is also from opensecrets.org. They classify the political viewpoint of the interest groups that they're tracking, and they classify the Sierra Club as a liberal interest group. It's interesting that environmentalism is considered a liberal cause. Anyway, so $124 million versus $79,000. That's the difference between the incentive structure that's operating for interest groups advocating for private interests and private benefits versus the public interest. Okay, I want to go back to and close this conversation with a discussion about what lobbyists do. Of course, the bottom line position is that they're trying to persuade policymakers to change policy in their favor, to do what they want them to do. But there's two important realities that I want to highlight as we close this conversation. And one is there are great disparities in the amount of access that some people have versus others to those policymakers. And the second is, and we've already touched on this in the chart that the book had, the table that the book had about the things that interest groups do. In some cases, interest groups actually basically eliminate the middlemen in the legislative process. They themselves helped craft legislation, which is the job of members of Congress, not interest groups. But on that first point, on unequal access to lawmakers, the representative for the 48th District in Congress in California is Darrell Issa. And here's how you or I would contact Darrell Issa. You'd go to his website, and there's a contact form, and there are several screens you go through, and you give your information, and you go through this process. So I did. This morning, before I recorded this video, I contacted Darrell Issa. I sent our member of Congress a note. I wrote about a student loan debt. I write to ask you to address the issue of student loan debt. The student loan industry is long engaged in predatory lending practices targeting some of our most economically vulnerable of our youth, leaving them with crushing debt and no real prospect for paying it off. This poses a severe threat to our nation's long-term well-being. Sincerely, me. Would I like a response? Yes, I would. So I submitted that earlier today. I'll let you know when I hear back from Representative Issa. If I hear back from Representative Issa in anything other than an automatically generated form letter reply, which I've done this before. I already know that's exactly what I'm going to get. It works a little bit differently if you're the CEO of JP Morgan, Jamie Dimon. The story that I'm highlighting here was from probably 2009 and 2010, and it was amid proposed legislation to regulate the banking industry in the aftermath of the financial collapse of the Great Recession. JP Morgan opposed those efforts to regulate the banking industry. Of course they did. Regulations limit what they can do, and they limit their profitability. To express his opposition to that banking legislation, Jamie Dimon himself telephoned individual lawmakers to urge them to vote for their version of the package, meaning he had their cell numbers. Jamie Dimon didn't fill out this form and send a message to Darrell Issa and then wait for a form automatically generated reply. Jamie Dimon has his phone number. I don't have Darrell Issa's cell phone number, nor do you. Jamie Dimon does. About that second point, this is the language of the bill that Dimon was calling on behalf of. The banking industry wrote big chunks of it. This is basically eliminating the lawmaker as the middleman in the legislative process. This is the draft that one banking industry lobbyist, Citibank, wrote of the legislation, and this is what ended up in the final bill. And the highlighted portions, of course, are the exact word for word. This is the same thing. If you submitted this to me on an exam, if you submitted something that I had found that I knew was existed elsewhere, that's plagiarism. You would fail. This is par for the course in interest group politics in the United States. This is the power of the banking lobby. Those in the positions of the greatest power don't submit form emails to contact members of Congress. They do so directly. They write actual parts of the legislation. I'm going to go back to the question I've raised many times throughout this class. Democracy means rule by the people. Do we have that in the United States? Okay, that's it for interest groups. Next up, the news media.